Good evening. Good evening. Okay. It's really a pleasure to be here. I will be accepting applications for that spot that was talked about at the end of my remarks. We don't have any favorites just yet. Job's still open. Senator Obama's got an open mind, and I think every one of you is qualified. I'm tempted to say certainly more qualified than, no, but I won't say that. Before I get into my prepared remarks, I want to talk a little about ACS. You all are, the vast majority of you are at the beginnings of your legal careers. And this is, I think, a particular time in our nation's history where the pendulum is starting to swing, or has swung. And I think the notion of a progressive America, an America run by progressives, is really, it's about to happen. And I think that one of the ways in which we can make sure that that happens is to be involved in organizations like this, not organizations like this, to be involved in this organization. And so I would hope that you will enjoy the weekend, that you'll enjoy the programs that we run during the course of the year, and that if you're a lawyer, you'll be active in the lawyer chapters. If you're a student, you will get involved in the chapters at your schools, and that you'll make ACS a part of your life. And for those of you who have the ability to write checks, we certainly want you to consider doing that, small, larger preferred, and really become, as I said, active members of this great organization. With this new administration that's going to be starting in January, I can't be political, I know, Lisa, I don't know. But with this new administration that will be taking its place in January of 2009, you know, we're going to be looking for people who share our values. And I suspect that a substantial number of those people are here today and in other parts of the country who are members of the ACS. So do all that you can to support this organization so that we can make our dreams really come true. So much for the commercial. We are about to celebrate the 4th of July, commemorating the anniversary of our great nation's Declaration of Independence. We celebrate our country and the values and ideals that it has stood for: liberty, equality, tolerance, and the rule of law. And we celebrate what our founders were able to create out of the sometimes painful birth pangs of that period, a nation of laws. The fundamental historical importance of our Constitution is really beyond measure. For the first time in the history of the world, a government was formed based first and foremost on the rule of law, and not the whims of men or the application of force. As Alexander Hamilton explained, the ratification of the Constitution represented for the first time in history that a government had been formed by reflection and choice and not by accident and force. And so many of the icons that we hold up for our country to revere are not great rulers of a time gone by, but documents that still shape the government that we have today: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Now, although containing only a few thousand words, these documents nevertheless still shape our values, our relationships with each other, and our political and cultural temperament today, over 220 years later. Now, that is not to say that the founders were perfect. Indeed, for nearly 100 years, the Constitution tolerated the possibility that someone like me could be bonded in property to another man. Women were not given the most fundamental of rights, the right to vote, until the 20th century. But what the Constitution did for the first time was form a government where the system of laws took priority over the whims of men or the strength of arms. And within this framework of the rule of law, the Constitution, there was contained the capacity for change. The choices the founders made were not frozen in time, but actually reflected the profoundly wise recognition that they could not see all things into the future. Rather than make rigid predictions, they set about to frame concepts broadly and openly in order to accommodate change and a noble pursuit of a more perfect union. Now, unfortunately, in the last few years, we have, quite frankly, lost our way with respect to this commitment to the Constitution and to the rule of law. The rule of law is not, as some have seen it, an obstacle to be overcome, but the very foundations of our nation. It is the rule of law that has held us together despite our differences, while other nations have descended into strife, and it is the rule of law that has made the United States a beacon to the world, a nation that others aspire to emulate. Now, of course, any student of history will note that this is not the first time that we have let fear take precedence over the values that define us as a people. At various times in our history, those charged with the responsibility to keep the nation safe have overreacted to perceived dangers, often with a sorrowful consequence for our nation. Even some of our greatest presidents, including John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt, have erred in this way. But a measure of our greatness as a nation is that we have quickly recognized our failures, reevaluated our judgments, and corrected our policies. It is time for us to do that again today. During the Civil War, President Lincoln faced the nation's greatest crisis. More than 600,000 soldiers lost their lives in that struggle. In order to safeguard the nation, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus on 8 separate occasions. Now, to my mind, some of those suspensions were clearly justified, but others were not. And by the end of the war, Lincoln had suspended the writ throughout the entire United States and authorized his military commanders to detain and imprison any person who was guilty of, quote, any disloyal act or practice, unquote. During World War II, in the months after Pearl Harbor, 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were ordered to leave their homes in California, Washington, Oregon, and Arizona, and told to report to detention camps in which they were confined for some 3 years, surrounded by barbed wire and military police. No charges were ever brought against these men, women, and children. There were no hearings, no findings of sabotage, espionage, or disloyalty. They were ordered to bring only what they could carry. Most families lost everything, and most importantly, they lost their liberty. Now, although the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of that internment order, rejecting the proposition that it was infected by racial prejudice, this decision has come to be regarded as one of the darkest moments in American constitutional history, and justifiably so. In a courageous dissenting opinion, Justice Frank Murphy described the court's decision in Korematsu as the, quote, legalization of racism. Now, I relate these historical incidents because it must inform our understanding of the present. In the months and years after 9/11, our government took many steps to ensure the safety and the security of our people, and many of them were necessary and appropriate. For example, we have, though not completely, improved our transportation security procedures, and we've partially disrupted the flow of money that financed terrorist operations. But other steps taken in the aftermath of the attacks were both excessive and unlawful. Although we did not respond to 9/11 by imprisoning Muslim Americans, our government authorized the use of torture, approved of secret electronic surveillance of American citizens, secretly detained American citizens without due process of law, denied the writ of habeas corpus to hundreds of accused enemy combatants, and authorized the use of procedures that violate both international law and the United States Constitution. Now, I do not question the motives, the patriotism of those responsible for these policies, but this does nothing to mitigate the fact that these steps were wrong when they were initiated, and they are wrong today. We owe the American people a reckoning. It is our responsibility as citizens to preserve and to protect our Constitution, for it is our Constitution and the freedom that it guarantees that makes the United States the envy of the world. Now, let me be clear. I firmly believe that there is evil in the world and that we still face grave dangers to our security. But our ability to lead the world in combating these dangers depends upon the strength not only of our military leadership, but our moral leadership as well. Sadly, that moral leadership has been fractured. To recapture it, we can no longer allow ourselves to be ruled by fear. We must evaluate our policies and our practices in the harsh light of day and steel ourselves to face the world's dangers in accord with the rule of law, as we have done in the past. Now, the history that I've recounted shows us that while we have lost our way before, we have never failed to correct our mistakes and stepped back onto the shining path envisioned by our founders and their Constitution. The time has come to take those steps once again. And nowhere is the restoration of our moral leadership and the rule of law more important than in the international struggle against terrorism. The term leader of the free world is bestowed upon the United States President because of the civil liberties and rights we guarantee our people. It comes from the power of our values as a nation. For the last 6 years, the position of leader of the free world has been largely vacant. We have ceded much of the moral high ground, which our own military leaders will tell you is a vital asset in our struggle against terrorism. In September 2001, immediately after terrorist attacks on 9/11, almost the entire world stood ready to follow our lead in the war against terrorism. The entire world was on our side. But in their pursuit of the war on terror, too many of our leaders have forgotten who we are as a nation, what it is that makes us stand above almost every other nation on earth. And as a result, our ability to lead, our ability to persuade, and to prevail in the struggle has been crippled. We have squandered one of our greatest strengths as a nation. Now, I never thought I would see the day when a Justice Department would claim that only the most extreme infliction of pain and physical abuse constitutes torture, and that acts that are merely cruel, inhuman, or degrading are consistent with United States law and policy. That the Supreme Court would have to order the President of the United States to treat detainees in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Never thought that I would see that a president would act in direct defiance of federal law by authorizing warrantless NSA surveillance of American citizens. This disrespect for the rule of law is not only wrong, it is destructive in our struggle against terrorism. Now, many have compared the Cold War, which President Kennedy called our long twilight struggle, to our current struggle against terrorism. I believe this comparison is apt to the extent that neither one has an ending on a traditional battlefield. But the comparison is even more compelling because both struggles are ones in which values, ideals, and morals are as important as military strength. In 5-6 short years, we have lost too much of the moral high ground. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not a popularity contest in which we are engaged. Of course, we should never jeopardize our security simply to be admired. But our needlessly abusive and unlawful practices in the war on terror have diminished our standing in the world community and made us less rather than more safe. As retired Generals Krulak and Hoare said recently, victory in the struggle against terrorism can only come when our enemy loses legitimacy in the society in which it recruits. We cannot expect to turn the tide on terrorism if we do not regain the respect of those in the Arab and Muslim world who still stand with us in rooting out the extremists among them. For the sake of our safety and our security, and because it is the right thing to do, the next president must move immediately to reclaim America's standing in the world as a nation that cherishes and protects individual freedom and basic human rights. First, we must close our detention center in Guantanamo Bay. A great nation should not detain people, military or civilian, in dark places beyond the reach of law. Guantanamo Bay is an international embarrassment. Some of our closest allies now see this prison as a symbol of what America has become. We should close Guantanamo Bay, transfer the remaining prisoners to military prisons in the United States, and adopt an expedited and procedurally fair review process for determining who we prosecute for war crimes, detain as combatants under the laws of war, or, yes, release. Second, we must declare without qualification that it is the law, policy, and practice of the United States government that we do not torture people and we do not subject people to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. Torture is illegal, immoral, counterproductive, and beneath the dignity and tradition of Americans. Third, we must end all U.S. government practices and programs, covert or otherwise, that transfer individuals involuntarily to other countries that are known to engage in torture. Extraordinary rendition is not a practice that began with this administration, but this administration has taken it to new levels, perhaps new lows. As Americans, we should bring people to justice and not hide them away from justice. Fourth, to those in the executive branch who say, just trust us, when it comes to secret and warrantless surveillance of domestic communications, I say, remember your history. In my lifetime, federal government officials wiretapped, harassed, and blackmailed Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders in the name of national security. One of America's greatest heroes, whom today we honor with a national holiday and countless streets and schools and soon a monument in his name, was treated like a criminal by those in our federal government possessed of too much discretion and a warped sense of patriotism. Watergate revealed similar abuses during the Nixon administration. These and other government abuses of power led the Congress to enact into law the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, FISA. We must utilize and enhance our intelligence collection capabilities to identify and to root out terrorists. But we must also comply with the law. We must also comply with FISA. If the defense, law enforcement, and intelligence communities are in agreement that FISA is too cumbersome to identify and combat terrorist activity, the next president should work with Congress to improve the law or give additional resources to the court that supervises the FISA statute or to the Justice Department. Those who tell us that we must engage in warrantless domestic surveillance, that we must engage in enhanced interrogation, or that we must engage in extraordinary rendition, or that we will cripple ourselves in combating terrorism, offer a false choice. There is simply no tension. There is no tension between an effective fight against those who have sworn to harm us and a respect for our most honored civil liberties tradition. We can never put the welfare of the American people at risk, but we can also never choose actions that we know will weaken the legal and moral fiber of our nation. If we do, we forget who we are as a country, and we will face far more terrorists and not fewer. As Americans, we must never seek to judge ourselves by our enemies' standards. In the struggle against terrorism, we will only prevail if we persuade millions of people from Morocco to Iraq to Indonesia that our values are more attractive than those of our enemies. We are the best example of a good nation that mankind has to offer. And the test of a great and good nation is whether we are strong enough to adhere to our values not only when it is easy, but also when it is hard. It is our task over the next several years to reverse the disastrous course that we have been on over the past few years. We as Americans must stand up and recognize the mistakes that we have made, and we as Americans together must begin the process of correcting those errors as we have in the past. Our great democratic institutions and our tremendous respect for law are, without doubt, strong enough to weather the storm as they have weathered so many before. The rule of law and our statute in the world are inevitably, historically, and inextricably linked. From the trials of Nuremberg to our victory in the Cold War, our respect for the rule of law has been a powerful tool to promote our national interest on the international stage. If we hope to take our place as a leader on that stage, we must reaffirm these, our most treasured values. This is our challenge. Thank you.